Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Aneta Idczak. Get the proper pronunciation in a minute. So this is someone who I found through the internet. She's a co-founder of something called Trauma Embodied Yoga. And I'm like, yoga, trauma, embodiment. Okay, we have to talk. Already, I'm in. Seems to be a very lovely person. Lots and lots of experience in the yoga world. And just to sort of get to know each other, isn't it really? So hello.
Hello, Mark. Thank you for having me here.
You're welcome. Where are you joining us from, Aneta?
I am based in Ramsgate in Kent, UK.
You're not so far away then, so in the Garden of England, up the coast. And this surname, is it Polish? It's East European, I guess. Well, how do I say it properly?
Aneta Idczak.
Right. All right. And where's that from? Just out of curiosity.
I am Polish and I've been living in UK for the last 29 years.
Oh, okay. So you're one of us now. But it's interesting. I just had a Polish guest on, 2 Polish guests in a row. And I wrote a theory that embodiment's going to be reborn in Eastern Europe. I've got a theory about this, but we'll come to that maybe later. So how did you get interested in the body, Aneta? What's your story?
Where do I start? Okay. I guess I can start from the beginning. I guess I arrived in London when I was 18. I came for 10 months and ended up staying for 29 years. I was only 18 and I hardly spoke English, even though I studied it for many years. It was kind of a shell shock experience. And I ended up just trying to forget, feeling like nobody cared and trying to numb it out. And it was beginning of 90s in London with the club scene and met lots of young people like me. But I was also interested in a spiritual side. And I was really lucky as I came across the Buddhist Center in Bethnal Green in London.
Yep.
And there were parts of the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, as they used to be called.
Triratna Order now. Yep, the same. I know a few people there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so they had a Buddhist Center, the vegetarian cafe, and the yoga studio. And I was really lucky because I got introduced to mindfulness and metta bhavana, the loving kindness meditation, and yoga at the same time. And so the 3 of those are the kind of basis of my practice. And so I've been practicing yoga for over 25 years. I trained as a mindfulness yoga and meditation teacher 11 years ago.
Who's that with? I'm familiar with the teachers I think I've heard of.
So it isn't anybody. It was actually run at the Bodywise, the Buddhist Center yoga studio. And it was run by a person who now moved to Brazil, who no longer is around. But interestingly, he was working at the Priory when I was working at City Roads Crisis Intervention Center. So his background and work was very similar, working with mental health and substance misuse. Working in Priory, and I was doing the same thing. So that's why I was really drawn to that teacher.
I noticed, I had a very close friend who was an aikido friend who'd come over from Poland, and that was the sort of very early days of immigration from Eastern Europe, and EU expansion had just happened, right? It's like sort of, back then there was a sort of unusual thing, before it kind of picked up momentum with numbers. And he was very much drawn to aikido. That's how I met him. He didn't speak English at the time. I ended up his best man at his wedding in Poland and became very close. But there was a whole wave of people from Eastern Europe who were interested in body mind arts. And they were definitely overrepresented at the Buddhist Center and the yoga studios. Let's say 5% of the population was from Eastern Europe, but like 20% of the yoga studios were full of Eastern Europeans. I wondered what that was. Was it like they weren't available in the sort of communist days? Was it sort of this hunger was it just the kind of people who would leave home and go to another country? They definitely seemed a sort of bias in the number of people doing those sort of things.
I think it was because there were quite few of us initially, and the people that came in, most of it, Polish people, were drawn together. So they were living together. They were kind of still speaking Polish at home, still, being in that cultural bubble. Whereas the people that I met that were from Poland or Eastern Europe that were interested and kind of exploring those practices were people who felt a little bit on the outskirts, that were seeking something, that felt like they didn't belong to this kind of culture.
I guess people were seekers. If it wasn't like a refugees or something, right? You didn't have to leave home. It was like a sense of like, hey, what's out there and what could be better and what's different. So I guess it was naturally the sort of seekers who were the first wave, certainly, of people, right, before it became a sort of normalized thing. So yeah, I definitely had that close contact with a few people in that wave. Okay, so you're studying the Buddhism, you're studying the yoga. Where did the trauma side come in? How did you get interested in that?
It came in a really roundabout way. The first few years were kind of mad in London, and then I started getting really interested. So I did a counseling training and I did some other trainings. And just by accident, when I was doing NLP Master Practitioner training, I met this guy who was a manager at the Substance Misuse Community Centre. And so we started talking, and he was doing kind of a support group. And then I was really interested in it, and I started volunteering and then started working there full time. And then I kind of ended up working in initially substance misuse and mental health. And then when we moved down to Kent, I started working in child protection and with troubled families agenda, setting up projects and supervising people. And so learning about trauma from the work, basically. The beauty of being in social care is that they send you on so much training.
Right.
All the
time. A lot of training, yeah.
Loads. And I'm probably just like you. I'm a course junkie. I love learning.
No, I can hear that already. And I definitely saw that in that wave of East Europeans. It's like I want to learn everything, like the enthusiasm for it, the hunger for it. And most of my friends, I think a lot of the people who listen to this podcast, they're learning junkies. We love learning. We love, if I look at people who are coming to the Embodiment Conference, they're like, oh my God, how am I going to learn about all these 1,000 speakers? And we're like, don't worry, we'll save the recordings. It's like our marketing, because everybody loves learning. And it's interesting. So I'm hearing two different tracks. So there's the sort of inner journey, Buddhism, yoga, meditation. And then there's also the service path. And often people don't mix those. It's quite rare. So you tend to have the inner seekers who want to go on retreat a lot and want to meditate every day for 2 hours, and then you tend to have the sort of helpers, and they tend to become either activists or social care workers, maybe nurses if they're a bit more mainstream. I've got a few Buddhist nurse friends, and they tend to be sort of two different groups. It's only recently I've seen people putting those together. That's become more common now, but engaged Buddhism, engaged activism, mindful activism. But it seems like you had both paths from sort of quite early days.
Yeah, I think work, it just came about in a way that yoga was my way of seeking to feel okay, to feel grounded, to be more at ease. And then the social care and the work that I did came together. And then I was really lucky when I was working in a crisis centre in London that we
explain what that is, just for foreign listeners, because that's quite a British concept, I think.
Sure. So it was a very unique service called City Roads Crisis Intervention Centre in the centre of London, in Islington, that been going for many, many years, that was working with very chaotic drug users, bringing them in a residential setting and putting them through a detox over 21 days. And then liaising with care managers and getting funding to send them off to the residential treatment. Yes, I don't want to go into the path of saying lots of that money and that funding has been cut so badly.
Right, well, no, let's name that. I think it's okay to name that the social service has been decimated in the UK. And there is a consequence to that. There is a consequence to that for people, whether it's someone robbing your house or someone suffering that you'll never see. There's definitely consequences there.
That's right. And that was also partially the reason why I left 4 years ago, because of the project that I was working and the bidding process and increasing the number of cases and, all of that kind of stuff, because I was supervising and, managing workers. I just thought that's unsafe. I don't want to do that.
where it's overloaded and it's just it's interesting. I always see adverts for like social workers and things that even though it's underpaid, it's understaffed, it seems like there's constant burnout and constant people churning who just kind of, because there's constant adverts up for those sort of jobs, even though they're actually have been cutbacks. There's not that many of the jobs, and I think it's just people can't handle it for long. And I've definitely seen people get into embodiment because they were burnt out. You know, I've been working with doctors and nurses lately, and I've worked with many groups of cancer care nurses and all sorts. And it's definitely people who get into this body mind stuff just because they're stressed. But I'm hearing with you, it's more like a parallel path. And sometimes yogis aren't totally attracted to things like drug rehab because there's a lot of chaos. You know, you work with homeless people, or, you know, I'm long-term sober, so I'm around other people who are just getting sober fairly regularly. And it's fucking chaotic. It's not neat yoga lines and it's shouting. It's people turning up late. It's people forgetting appointments. It's people turning up drunk. It's people forgetting to pick up their kids. It's, you know, it's chaos. And sometimes the sort of control freak side of the yogi doesn't like that kind of chaos so much.
Yeah. I think because of my early years in London, I had the personal experience of quite a lot of chaos. So actually it's, you know, as I became calmer and more centered, I had more resources to work with other people. And the interesting thing is, you know, I started saying that when I was in a crisis center, we had people coming in, and that's when I realized that I could actually train as a yoga teacher, because I was responsible for arranging activities to kind of keep people who are not sleeping and detoxing and climbing the walls.
Right,
Let's keep them occupied.
I've been there. You need to burn off that charge. Yeah, keep busy.
Oh God. But actually, some of the activities were amazing. I organized 5 rhythms, and we had this lady from the North London Buddhist Center coming in who actually did loving kindness, Metta Bhavana, which was amazing, absolutely amazing, exactly what people needed, and they really connected.
Yeah, loving kindness meditation is a very good one for people who are in crisis, suffering from anger, fear. It's a go-to for me. And, you know, sometimes I have to change the language a little bit, and change the method a little bit. Some of the normal Buddhist ways of teaching are a bit too fluffy for some groups, but the basic practice is a solid one for sure.
And we also had, in addition to that, a yoga teacher, and that's when I realized that I could actually maybe bring the two together. Maybe I could train, and really I trained in mindfulness, yoga and meditation, because I thought that would be really the most suitable for this client group and for myself, and for rather than doing, you know, there was a time that for quite a few years I did Ashtanga Mysore style. And as I was working in a crisis center, I actually had to stop it. It was too much.
Too much yang, too much pushing.
Completely. I needed something calmer, and I thought that would work really, really well. And from there, interestingly, every time I prioritize self-care and my practices over not having lunches, running around, starting working at 6 a.m, you know, outside of office hours just to catch up and be on top of the work, that's when the shifts always happens. That's when I made the decisions, right, that's it. I either need to change the job, or I need to move on, or I need to change something because this is not working.
You know, it's interesting how when we choose to go there, where we suddenly go, do I really want to do this with my life? You know, when there's space to breathe and go, I've been doing that lately. I've been, you know, I do this big embodiment conference, which I love. But what I've also seen is that I'm essentially going to become the director of a massive embodied online learning company. And I was just sort of took a moment in the park. I was talking to a coach. And I just went, I think I want to do that. I'm a teacher. I want to be interviewing people and teaching people and mentoring people. I don't really want to be in marketing meetings for 3 hours every day with tech people. I mean, that's a different world, you know, and I just kind of had to take that step back and say, okay, so after the conference, I'll employ someone to run the company and I'll just come in and teach, you know, and it's so I went, okay, so that, you know, but sometimes it's just that little bit of space to go, what do I actually want? What do I feel? And what are my real values here, you know?
Yeah. And I really love what you just said, because all the answers are within you. And if you take a moment and you pause, you know, and pay attention to what it's trying to tell you, you will learn something new. And
it's often obvious, right? It's often sort of like, well, of course, like it's not like this big flash of lightning or whatever. It's just like, oh yeah, that's just who I am and what I like to do. How did I get off track? Weird. Yeah. And what about the trauma then? What did you have, a trauma education? Did you sort of get into the sort of Boston side of things and their trauma yoga theories? Like, how did you add? Because a lot of yoga people aren't very trauma informed. Until recently, trauma and yoga were two separate worlds. It wasn't long ago that the average yoga teacher was a fucking nightmare for trauma. And now I'm seeing some real big improvements. The yogis on the conference are all interested in Pete Levine's work, or, I went to Irene Lyons' course and, yogis are on that course. So it seems like things have come a long way. But back when you were doing yoga, it wasn't trauma informed generally.
No. And I think because of my work, because I, 16 years working in social care, trying to provide a safe space for people, and the countless trainings that I've done through my work, it was always about that kind of approach, the mental health side of things. And I worked with a lot of people who had drug-induced psychosis when they start detoxing. I've worked with families in their homes where there is domestic violence and there is all kicking off, and, the suicides and of teenagers, all of that kind of stuff, mental health and disability. I never actually realized how much my yoga teaching was informed by all that training and my work in social care. It's only afterwards that I once I started investigating and I started reading and I started, because I'm a complete bookworm as well, and started talking to other people, I suddenly realized, well, there is all that experience actually can be used working in a bit more direct way. Because my experience is the same as yours, that a lot of yoga teachers never had any kind of mental health training. Yeah. They never had any, they never giving it any thought to actually think about.
Yeah, if you've had a different life and it comes from the other side of the world, and it's just not something that if people haven't been on the sharp end of things, like, you did with your work or whatever, it's not necessarily on their radar. So who can blame them? It wasn't something they were taught in their school. And sometimes there's this sort of transcending quality of, that's all just suffering, we leave that behind. So there's, that sort of anti kind of don't go there, just transcend it kind of vibe. I mean, what would you say are the key pieces then? Someone's listening to this, they're a yoga teacher, maybe they've heard of trauma, maybe they've heard of Bessel van der Kolk or Peter Levine. What would be your sort of top, right, here's the things every yoga teacher should know as the basic starter pack?
So number one is that it's actually all down to you. If you can hold the space and feel grounded within yourself and hold compassionate boundaries for somebody else, then you can do it. It's actually because a lot of it is common sense, thinking about how to deal with somebody who's distressed, how to help somebody to calm down if they overstimulated, giving people choice. Yep. And a sense of agency, something that is definitely taken away when you are experiencing trauma, is number one thing.
So there's a couple of things you said that are really interesting already, right? One, yoga is about self-regulation, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's usually about calming yourself down, sometimes about waking yourself up. So, but it's got self-regulatory tools built into it, all the breathing exercise, the asana, whatever. Second, so yoga's almost got that already there. There's some common sense things, isn't there, of sort of like, what's too much, what's too little, right?
That's right.
Like we do this all the time. We do this when we're on a date. We do this when we talk to a child. We do this when we meet a new person. Like we're meeting for the first time. So I'm not like telling you like my biggest stories in the world, because there's a sort of getting to know each other. There's a sort of, there's a felt sense of that in the body and just socially. But then the authority one's interesting, isn't it? Because on the one hand, people that have often had trauma have had their sense of agency violated. Like that's almost by definition, right? It's like you had a boundary, someone crossed it, and you couldn't defend yourself, right? For whatever reason, you couldn't say no because you're in the fight or flight, freeze response, or you couldn't fight someone off, or you were too young, or they were your boss, or there's all these reasons why you lost that power, and you can develop this sense of powerlessness, lose that sense of agency, and now a yoga class is generally doing exactly what you're told by someone else. That's a normal yoga class, right? Mm-hmm. So what you're saying about choice, that's not the yoga that I first encountered. Like that's not the Ashtanga primary series.
No.
Right?
Yeah, definitely not.
But this is so self-regulation is probably yoga. Your yoga is probably self-regulatory, but it's not necessarily about choice. That's often a bit new. So maybe you could say a little bit more about that piece.
I think ultimately it's about helping people to develop inner self-trust and helping them to learn how to self-regulate. Every single, for 16 years working in social care, it's always about what I learned. One thing, it's always about helping people to be able to do stuff for themselves, not rely on services, not rely on anybody else. And it's the same with yoga, allowing people to have a choice, whether you're doing it privately or in a class, and saying to them, listen within your body. How does it feel? If it feels like it's too much, back off. One of the signs is if your breathing is too heavy, your body is already telling.
That's a simple,
exactly.
Right? So but sometimes,
yeah, but sometimes not breathing is just that they're concentrating so much. So if you remind them to breathe, maybe they can stay in that pose. Maybe it is right on the edge if they remember to breathe. So if you come to any of my classes, you will hear me talking a little bit, are you still breathing? Are you trying to? It's one of the ironies
of being an embodiment teacher. You're constantly reminding people to breathe and getting paid for it. I always thought that was quite funny. I'm like, breathe, and I say, you're paying me money to say this.
But if I can say one other thing, is about the poses. Mm-hmm. It's just reminding people. I think there can be quite a lot of competition and challenge in the classes. Certainly over the years, I've been in classes where people are trying hard because the person next to them is trying really hard, but they've been practicing for 10 years and there is a new person and all of that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of it is down to conditioning. And so people sometimes need to hear again and again. We all have different bodies. We all need to just pay attention within. We all need to just, I can invite people to do that. If it doesn't feel right, they can rest. They can do another variation of the same pose.
Yeah.
Because ultimately,
comparison and competition and natural human tendencies, and they're conditioned, and we may choose to go with them or not, right? Like that's not I think it's a very normal thing for people to do, to compare and to compete, and we may choose to step away from that in a yoga environment. I don't think we have to, actually, but I think it's useful to notice if it's habitual. I think it becomes just an equal tyranny to say there's no competition, there's no comparison, because that, again, at this point, there's no choice again.
I completely agree, but it has to be, but sometimes that competition is illogical. And what people don't realize is, I can tell you a little story. So this guy came into the class, very clear Ashtangi.
Looks smart,
yeah, very, very clearly. Came in, was in the first row of the class, and we were doing our practice. And I've seen him before when I still had studio a couple of years ago. He came to one of the classes and the reaction of everybody else was the same. So everybody is looking because he is so ultra mobile. And I can see how people are watching and kind of, I can almost
this is the real yoga. He's good at yoga.
I can almost kind of read their thoughts. And then so he left. It was quite nice. Said hello, kind of, we chatted. The next week, as we came in, a couple of people said, I wish I was able to do that. This is where it's a bit of an illogical thinking.
Right.
So I said to them, I said to them, of course you can. If you are able to devote 2 hours per day for a few years, you will be like that. It's great.
What age, right? If I'm in a yoga class and there's a 19-year-old skinny mini young girl next to me, of course she's going to be more flexible. I'm a 40-year-old bloke who sits at a desk most of the day. Yes, I exercise. Yes, I walk in the park. Yes, I'm an embodiment teacher. But I'm twice her age and I'm a geezer. I've got twice as much muscle mass as she has or will ever have, right? This is just biology. So it's like, if I'm comparing my flexibility to her or she's comparing her strength to me, it's just not going to happen. I'm stronger than her. She's more flexible than me. We're different human beings. Like, why are you compared? It's not logical.
Exactly. So, but sometimes people don't recognize that.
Right. I guess I'm with you on that 100%. And where I'm also adding is that I find in Buddhist centers and those kind of environments, it becomes another kind of tyranny that we have to be cooperative all the time. And, sometimes it's good to be like, right, I did 4 pull-ups yesterday. I'm going to try and do 5 today. And I'm not going to hurt myself, but that's appropriate. Competing with my past self from 2 days ago may have some appropriateness to it. Right. And I don't want to like repress that yang side, or else it ends up, you end up getting the passive aggressive Buddhists. I did martial arts, and Buddhists were always the most aggressive people. Always. Whenever we did martial arts, Buddhists were the worst they're always tweaking you and hitting you when you're not looking. It's because they'd repressed that. So it's like, I think we need to address that side too.
Quick break from the interview to tell you about our shop and a deal we've got on there, and also about some events that are coming up. So if you go to Embodied Facilitator /shop and use the code podcast 50 is the code, you can get 50% off anything in the shop. And what do we got on there? How to design training, trauma for facilitators, breath work, leadership, resilience, life purpose. There's a bunch of books, there's a bunch of e-courses, mostly for facilitators, trainers, coaches, yogis, different ebooks. But that code will give you 50% out off anything at all there in the shop. So that could save you, let's say, up to £100, which is about $120. So well worth having that code. Go to embodiedfacilitator.com/shop. Also on that website, you will see embodiedfacilitator.com/events-calendar. Just look under events under the main title. You'll see all the stuff we've got coming up for events. We regularly have free online events. If you're interested in embodiment, we have them on coaching, life purpose, marketing, all trauma, all sorts of things. So have a look at the events page. You can see the different one-day events we've got coming up related to the conference and all kinds of other stuff. Okay, so all of that is on embodiedfacilitator.com. And remember that code there. That code is podcast50 if you want 50% off anything. There you go. A good deal. Back to the interview.
Okay, so giving choice, stepping away from maybe the old yoga model where there isn't so much choice. And we've had other people on the show, Sarah Holmes de Castro and other trauma-informed yoga teachers that have talked about, offering suggestions like, hey, you can do it this way, and not making one more advanced, right? Like, why is it more advanced to get your foot behind your head? It's just different, right? And choices, self-regulation, working with boundaries, working with trust, self-trust. One thing you said I think is not obvious, though, which is self-listening. So you hear a yoga teacher say, listen to your body. What does that mean? And someone that's been traumatized may have a numb body. They may be like trying to repeat their own trauma, right? That sort of repetition compulsion urge. They might be so used to intensity from all the adrenaline of this hyperarousal of their trauma that they constantly push it too hard because that feels normal to them. Or they may be so spaced out that any feeling at all is numbing, is too intense. So it's not an obvious thing to someone with trauma to say, listen to your body, or your body knows. It's a bit more complicated than that, isn't it?
Definitely. And that's, yeah. And my feeling is that a lot of people who talk about listening to your body don't really know how to do that because it's not specific enough. Right. And it's another skill, really, to be able to do that. So there are two things, really. When it comes to yoga, understanding that the body communicates through sensations and how to respond to those sensations. And that's where compassion comes in, and inviting people the sense of agency. And then there is the other side, which is listening to the body wisdom as we do in focusing, which is the embodied listening, which is a slightly different practice altogether.
Yeah, there's a bit deeper in there, isn't it? Not just sensation level, it's a little bit slower, deeper, a bit more to it. Trauma's got really popular. I was looking at our figures the other day for the podcast, and I'd say 15 to 20% of the episodes are on trauma. But of the top 10 episodes, 70% of them are on trauma. So
I'm not surprised, to
why
be
has
honest.
It got so popular? I mean, other than it's useful, it's good to know, trauma's common, but why is it like all of a sudden? I mean, like the trauma people from the conference, like Pete Levine or Gabor Mate, they're the most famous people that we have at the conference.
Yeah.
Right?
Two of my favorite people.
They're great. They're great work, but they're megastars. Irene Lyons, these people, they're huge followings. So what has happened that it's in the space of, I would say, 3 to 5 years, maybe 3 in the UK, 5 in the US, maybe in Poland it's just coming in. How and why has it got so big?
I think personally because it's changed the treatment, and that the description and the definition of trauma has changed. Where people used to think that it's only people who were officially diagnosed with PTSD, like war veterans or somebody who experienced an attack or that's what used to be classified as trauma. These days, in the last few years especially, the definition of trauma has changed. And one of the really lovely definitions that I read, and I was trying to remember before we were talking where I read it and who wrote it, but I couldn't remember. It just said it's simply too much or too little for too long.
Wow. Yeah, overwhelm is another way I've heard it talked about. And there's people that I really talk about nervous system health. People that look at it as more of a memory issue. Some people who look at it more as an activation, just looking at it in terms of like too little or too much activation and, things that trigger that. So there's ways to talk about it now where you don't have to talk about child abuse, right?
That's right.
I mean, even to the point where it can get a little bit ridiculous sometimes, but I think there's a hot, because we're all on, if people say to me, have you been traumatized? I don't know how to answer. Do I go, well, these were the worst things that happened in my life. Maybe there was worse things, but they were pretty bad. Or do I say, well, we've all been traumatized. We've all got overwhelming experience. We've all got a degree of numbing, like this there was a period with COVID where there was like a collective numbing where everyone was a little bit dissociated and spaced out. And then there was another period in the COVID curve where everyone was a bit hyper aroused and, panic buying. And, it's sort of more broad ways to talk about it now. I think that's definitely a part of it, isn't it? Like the shame has gone a little bit. It's more known.
Yes, I think that's a big thing, the shame. It's the same with mental health. That's been over the last few years. A lot of people have spoken out about depression, about anxiety, about OCD, about really, insomnia. Something that people never used to want to talk about at all because it was nobody wanted a label.
Yeah. You didn't want to be. Now having anxiety wouldn't be like a big deal. Depression. I think there's still some taboo around schizophrenia. I don't know many people who would freely admit sort of psychosis as a thing. But is there anything else what else is still taboo in the mental health world?
Manic depressive, I think.
A little bit.
Bipolar, I think that's still a little bit there.
Still there? I think that's getting better. What about personality disorders? No one's going to say they're a narcissist or a psychopath. That's still taboo.
But this is one of the diagnoses that when I worked with mental health and substance misuse, most of my clients who came in, some of them had everybody had some kind of mental health diagnosis. Without a question. Some of them had 5 different ones.
Wow, that's good going. 5. I got ADHD, PTSD, a little bit of
OCD, and all of that kind of personality disorder. And you just kind of think, well, how is it? How can you have all of those different things in one person?
I mean, they're all just extensions of normal personality traits, aren't they? If I look at my accountant or Daniela, who runs the conference, I mean, they've both got OCD professionally on their Excel spreadsheets, and they're paid to have OCD, but it hasn't gotten to a point where it's causing serious distress or disruption to their life, right? And were their life conditions different? Were they abused as kids? Were they having stress now? It might get to a point where it became a pathology rather than simply a professional skill, you know? So there is that.
I think it's the same with trauma. It's exactly the same thing. That is, you have got PTSD, but you also can have a lot of undiagnosed trauma where there are trauma symptoms of the lower level. And the way that we're working with trauma at the moment, with the titration and the small practices like orienting and centering and grounding and embodied body scan and all of that kind of stuff, anybody would benefit from it.
Right. Or culturally, right? Like when was the last time you were in Poland?
Well, I have to think. In January.
Okay. I've been there a couple of years ago. So I've been to Poland like a dozen times. I did a lot of dating, and my wife's a Polish-speaking Ukrainian. And if I spend time in Ukraine or Poland, I mean, I look around, and just from people's bodies, I go, most people in this pub could benefit from trauma work, right? Just from the freezing or the numbing, or and for some people it's very obvious. Certain, I'm in Israel, I'm thinking, fucking hell, everyone needs to do some trauma discharging in this whole country, And And other times I'm like, it's just a few people if I'm in Norway. But there's definite ways in which we all benefit from it. And I'm a big fan of advocating people don't simply get well enough to survive, but get well enough to thrive. And, I say to people, look, if you're not in crisis, if you have the money and the emotional resources and stability, do trauma work then. Do trauma work on the stuff that's there under the surface, which is going to kick off when there's a COVID or when there's a divorce, or do you know what I mean? Because there's always stuff under the bonnet that you could do a bit of work on. Yeah,
I completely agree with that. And I guess this is why I teach in the way that I teach. And this is why I have got clients that have been, with me for 7-8 years that come in and, they like it because it's a really useful skill for living your life in a more embodied way, more present, connected way, more stable way. And this is where exactly what you mentioned earlier about the leg behind the head. When it comes down to the quality of life,
who gives a fuck?
Exactly. How much of more of quality of life you're going to have with that practice?
Right. Like there is a degree of flexibility you need, right? Like I want to be flexible enough that I can put my jumper on without getting, stiff arms. I want to be able to pick up my niece, and I want to be able to have wild sex or whatever. There are different things that I want to be able to do, but none of those require that level of flexibility. I'm not Sting. I'm not that interesting. It's none of them require that level of flexibility. So I sort of go, why would I devote time to that? Because time is short, and there's other things I could be doing.
Just for the fun of it, maybe.
Yeah, that's okay.
Like it,
that's okay. But it doesn't make you more spiritual. It doesn't make you a better yogi. If you want to do it for the fun of it, good for you. It's nice to have goals. What do we say to the more intermediate to advanced people here then? So a lot of people know the basics of trauma now. They know that it comes from overwhelm. They know that there's numbing symptoms, hyperarousal symptoms. They know that there's treatments like EMDR and somatic experiencing.
Yeah.
They know that it's cultural. They know that it's very unique in individuals. They know the basics, right? They've listened to 10 of my podcasts on this, and they go, okay, get it, Mark. Yeah. So what would be the sort of next level that you might want to say to people that got some experience already with this area?
For me, I guess, it would be how you're going to use it for the benefit of your community. How you're going to use it. If you've got some understanding of it, why not share it? And that's when we move into that social engagement with other people. I'm part of some of the groups locally, like Women's Soroptimist International group.
What? Sorry? Women's what?
It's Soroptimist International. It's women's group that come together voluntarily and promoting human rights of women and girls.
Okay.
And it's all over the world. It's been going on for a very long time. We've done a lot of work with Oasis, Refuge locally. We've done some wellness events. We've done some stuff around.
Do you think there seems to be a really big thrust in the world at the moment towards sort of women and girls issues again, and human rights, abuse issues, everything from sex trafficking to just sort of basic microaggression, mansplaining, and everything in between, and particularly in the mind-body world, and it's sort of like all of a sudden this interest has come into the mind. I'm even seeing it used as a sort of slightly crass marketing tool, if I'm honest, by girl power kind of style of things. And I think some of it's very cynical, some of it's completely authentic, some of it's sort of very angry and kind of slightly off-putting as a man, and some of it I completely want to support. So, I don't want to put anyone in the same box here, and yet I can see this movement that did not exist 5 years ago in the same way. There was a little bit of sort of Shakti yoga, a little bit of sort of menstrual cycle stuff, but this is mainstream now. I was on a Skype call with a colleague the other day, and she very quickly sort of said something about where she was in her cycle. And I was just like, okay, that's good to know. And that's not something that happened to me a few years ago, So it was, what do you think's going on with that? It looks pretty positive, but I'm curious.
I think it's because women come together loads more.
Uh-huh.
I used to run women's moon lodges, and we used to do all sorts of different practices and talk about stuff. And I think we have got a new generation of women coming in, women around my age. So I'm 47 now. the women that maybe were focused on their children, and now they're beginning to go into their 40s and their 50s.
But it's young women too. I'm seeing like 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds.
Yeah.
They've all been told at university, they're massively privileged young women who have been told somehow they're victims. And I find that a little bit hard to stomach sometimes. But it does seem like it's across the board. I'm seeing it from sort of 20 to 50 kind of thing, you know.
I think in a sense it's a really positive thing.
Yeah.
And in a sense, it has to swing one way to go the other way into the balance.
I hear that a lot, and I'm not a fan of that theory. But yeah, and mostly I also think it's a positive thing, just for the record. I'm glad my niece is growing up in a world where this is a thing, you know, where it's, you know, there's those sort of things encouraged. But yeah. Okay, I mean, we're in the last sort of 50 minutes here. Tell us a little bit more about the trauma embodied yoga then. So is it just what we've been talking about? Is it a system? Do you train people in it? Tell us a little bit about the nuts and bolts of that.
Okay, so I've come together with a friend called Kerry Morgan, who has got slightly different background than me. She has been teaching yoga for about 18 years. She trained with Simon Law and trained with other professionals. And she's done quite a lot. She's a trained counselor, and she's also trained in different modalities, just like me. She's done quite a lot of work in prisons. So in a sense, we worked with similar client groups, but our background is slightly different. So it was really lovely to come with somebody who views this process of healing as a multi-layered thing. So not just using yoga, but also using other modalities to help people on their journey to, self-regulate and really meeting somebody where they are at. And doing it in in social care, we work a lot in biopsychosocial model. And so bringing the spiritual aspect to it as well, and working in the needs-led way. So meeting the client, the student, in a way that where they are at, and helping them from that space, rather than having a very rigid model of how to do that. So we bring in, at the moment, what we're doing is we accredited a course with Yoga Alliance UK professionals. It's a 4-day course, 62 hours. And we taking people through theoretical stuff, understanding what trauma is, the theories around it, but also having practical skills to work with people in the classes. So how do you recognize?
I'm going to jump in. If people are interested in this, the website is anetai.co.uk, AN for November, ETAI.co.uk.
That's right, yeah.
Check that out. And that's you and your co-trainer there. We have 25 Facebook friends in common with your co-trainer. I should probably contact her at some point. Okay. And tell us about the practical skills. What? Because the theory I think people kind of get, but often I get like yoga teachers, they learn, they go, okay, get it, overwhelm, okay, hyperarousal, okay, so what kind of thing, you know? That's the bit I'm curious about.
Exactly, and that's how we coming from the same perspective. It's like, so what? So you can buy a book, read about it, understand it on a mental level, but actually, how do you bring it into your class? How do you interact with your students in a way that is actually working for you and for them? So bringing the practical applications of mindfulness, of metta bhavana, co-regulation, all those practices like centering and orienting. So some stuff from somatic experiencing, some of the stuff that I really love. But also working with other things like the sound. You know, the sound can be extremely soothing and extremely grounding. And how do you use the practices that really allow you to regulate rather than start going up and up and up and up and up and up and I am so wired and everything is which I've seen in some of the classes happening as well, and people get really, you can see it in their bodies how stressed out they become. So really those practical skills, and actually how it's, you know, having time to reflect. How do you teach as a yoga teacher right now? How can you teach in a slightly different way? How can you create something that actually would work for you and the client group that you are working with, because different client groups have different needs. If I go and work in a crisis center or in prison, I have to bring different skills to when I work with over 60 group of ladies.
And this is intermediate and advanced level embodiment teaching of all kinds. You know, I'm just marking an exam of one of my students today, embodied coaching exam that from our course, Embodied Facilitator Course, and she sent me this exam. I'm looking at it, and what's one of the things I'm looking for? Like, is she adapting? Yeah. Right? Because you can't teach business people like they were doctors, or doctors like they were yogis, or you just can't, right?
Exactly.
This is basic. And sometimes I see even very famous teachers just sort of rattle off their class. I'm like, you're on Zoom now. It's different. You're not in a yoga festival or a yoga class with 5. You know what I mean? It's real different. Like, I'm always surprised when that skill's missing, but it seems to me not even advanced, like intermediate and above should have that skill, really. Yeah. Practical tips. So practical things for yoga teachers. Tell me a bit more, the nuts and bolts of things that you teach. Was that a secret?
No, not at all. I think it's a lot of it is in what I already said. It's quite a lot of it is common sense. That creating a sense of safety, allowing people to have a choice. If you're doing a yoga pose, giving people a choice and giving people modifications, reminding people to breathe, reminding people to look around. You know, one of the things that I see quite a lot in yoga classes is that people close their eyes when they're standing up in a standing poses. Some people can do that, but that's usually a sign that somebody just got lost within somewhere there. They're not fully grounded, not fully present in the moment. And they could, you know, in a worst case scenario, they could tip over. So really reminding people to come back within the body, feeling the sensation of the feet steady on the ground, every so often shaking everything off to take that tension around and have a bit of joy, have a bit of fun, reminding people to notice, you know, is it pleasurable or are you straining really, really badly?
Are you having a nice time? Are you enjoying yourself?
Why not? Yoga should be fun. You're coming in to stretch, to move, to feel alive. If you're just working really hard, pushing and straining, then you know, something's so much fun. Balance there.
Okay, well, is anything I haven't asked you about that you'd love to speak about before we sort of move towards wrap up here? Is anything you thought, that's so key to what I do that we haven't touched on?
Yeah, one last thing, I guess, it's the focusing, the embodied listening. Cool. And that's something that I've been practicing formally for the last couple of years. So I've come across it a few years back. I read a book and I practiced it on my own. But I've done the modular training, so over the whole year, 5 modules, and I'm now doing the practitioner training. And that is a completely life-changing practice. And that completely changed how I am and how I work with my clients. So one of the things that I hear a lot when I work with people, especially on a one-to-one basis, is that people say, I know all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. I understand all of this, but I'm still doing the same stuff and I don't know what's happening. I don't understand why I can't change it, because I understand that it comes from my mother. I understand that it's my reaction. I understand that something else happened that influences my behavior, but I can't change it. And often what it means is that people are coming from the level of the mind, the logical mind.
Understanding, yeah.
Yeah, I understand.
That's confusing for people that if I understand something, surely that's enough. It's all about the brain, right? It's all about, you know, and it's a little bit like, okay, you might have to go deeper. You might have to grok it. You might have to have a really strong experience there, you know, like I do focusing fairly regularly. And I recently, you know, I sort of cognitively got with my therapist that something was coming from like a Irish cultural background from where I come from. And then I was like, okay, get it. I'm working too hard because, you know, I'm Irish and my grandparents were peasants and they had to work really hard. And okay, that makes sense. But nothing changed in my own life. And then it's like I did a focusing session where I really like felt into how it was to be that like Irish peasant side of me that was scared to not have enough food and had to toil the land really hard. And it was like, wow. And it was deep. And then after that, my behavior started changing. but it wasn't the same as cognitive knowing. It was a deeper level of feeling like, and it took like 30-40 minutes to get there. You know, it was a slow, deep feeling into. It wasn't like this sort of conversation we're having today.
Yeah, and that's the magic of that form of embodied listening. It's not just awareness. You can be aware of it, you can understand it on the logical mind, but you might not be able to actually change it unless you connect with the part of you that is responsible for that. And it means sitting a lot with the unknown, something that is not clear, something that is quite vague, feeling it in the body, and actually being quite open and curious to it, and holding it all within the compassionate presence. And for myself, I am starting to run yoga teacher trainings, the foundational teacher trainings from October. And that is going to be a vital part of the training, to actually teach those fledgling yoga teachers those skills of embodied listening.
Nice addition to the work, yeah, because it's a different thing than just feel your feet on the ground, isn't it? It's a different level.
Yeah, and that practice of working with felt senses is very much used now in somatic experiencing work, working with trauma, and in other therapeutic approaches. And it doesn't have to be therapy based. Originally it wasn't when it came out, but it's the part that makes the therapy successful in the end.
Okay, Aneta, this has been fun. It's been nice to get to know you a little bit. I think we've got lots in common. I hope I'll see you in other things we do with the community, the COVID Calm or the conference and other things like that. In terms of finding out more about you, that website again is AN for November, ETAI.co.uk. And right. You can see the trauma trainings. You've got an event in October, haven't you? Which I think is the first weekend of the trauma training is in October. So we'll make sure we get it out. Well, we'll definitely get it out before then. Cool. And do you have a kind of closing message about the body? Anything you want to close with? A message for our Polish listeners? Probably never heard Polish on this podcast before.
Just that from my own experience and working with other people, is that your body is your gateway to wisdom. And if you only bring curiosity, openness, and kindness to your relationship with your body, it can profoundly change your life.
Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you. Appreciate your time. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/Embodiment Podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodiedfacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. Most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodiedfacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodiedfacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator Course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you. Until next time, welcome home to the body.